Cascadia and the moral architecture of constitutional renewal, civic autonomy, self-defense, and the ethics of lawful resistance. Abstract. The draft Constitution of Cascadia and Sovereign Persons Reverend 0.100.02.001.42.2 articulates a revolutionary framework of governance rooted in natural law, civic autonomy, and lawful resistance. It presents a constitutional philosophy in which liberty is not a contingent grant of government but the inherent expression of personhood. All power is originally inherent in and consequently derived from the people. All members of government are their trustees and servants. Art. I. Section 0. This article investigates the moral and theoretical foundations of Cascadian governance as an experiment in radical accountability and lawful reform. Drawing from the natural rights theories of John Locke, the constitutional moderation of Montesquieu, and Jefferson's doctrine of moral revolution, it argues that Cascadia transforms revolution from an act of violent upheaval into a civic mechanism of lawful renewal. Through the principles of self-defense, restoration, and civic reintegration, Cascadia redefines political legitimacy as a reciprocal covenant of conscience, grounded in both personal sovereignty and collective moral agency. In comparison to the U.S. constitutional model, Cascadia expands upon Enlightenment doctrines by reasserting the inseparability of moral law, civil accountability, and the perpetual right to reform. Methodology. Interpreting Cascadian governance as a philosophical legal text. The methodological approach in this study draws from comparative constitutional hermeneutics, reading the Cascadian document as a fusion of normative jurisprudence, natural law ethics, and republican institutional theory. The analysis treats each constitutional provision not merely as a legal clause but as a moral proposition, a statement about the nature of personhood and the legitimacy of authority. This approach follows the interpretive logic of Locke's Second Treatise of Government, 1689, which argued that the only just powers of government are those which are necessary to secure property and liberty. Similarly, the Cascadian Constitution explicitly states, greater than, the sole object and only legitimate end of government is to protect the citizen in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and self-defense, and when the government assumes other functions this becomes unjust usurpation and oppression. Preamble, Section IV. By reading this text through both Enlightenment moral rationalism and modern participatory ethics, the analysis proceeds as an inquiry into how Cascadia transforms the Lockean social contract into a living, renewable covenant, a constitutional ecology of conscience and accountability. The hermeneutic framework employed is tripartite. 1. Textual natural analysis, examining how the text defines natural rights, self-defense, and lawful resistance. 2. Comparative jurisprudence, contrasting these doctrines with the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and Jeffersonian writings on reform and resistance. 3. Philosophical synthesis, interpreting Cascadia's provisions through Locke's natural law, Montesquieu's moderation, and Thoreau's ethics of conscience, situating Cascadia as a synthesis between libertarian voluntarism and civic republicanism. I. The natural law of sovereign persons. At the heart of Cascadian governance lies a radical reaffirmation of jus naturale, the doctrine that moral law precedes political order. The text declares, greater than, a law repugnant to natural, human rights is no law at all, but an edict opposed to the precept of the just authority, and therefore, invalid on its face. Art. I. Section 0. This echoes the Thomistic and Lockean assertion that legitimate law must be rooted in the moral nature of human beings. For Locke, the law of nature stands as an eternal rule to all men, no human sanction can be good or valid against it. Second Treatise, Section 135. Cascadia internalizes this doctrine as a constitutional axiom. The state's legitimacy derives not from sovereignty over persons, but from its obedience to the natural sovereignty of persons themselves. Where the United States Constitution recognizes rights as protected by government, Cascadia inverts this ontology. Rights exist before and beyond government. The state is a servant mechanism, its sole duty being to preserve the natural liberties that precede its own existence. This inversion marks a philosophical evolution from government of rights to government under rights. As the text asserts, greater than, the government of Cascadia shall aim to maximize the positive physical and emotional experience of the people while minimizing the negative, respecting them as sovereign, with an emphasis on building successful, resilient, independent, and self-sufficient communities. Preamble, Section V. This organic conception of governance, founded upon the living sovereignty of the individual, resonates with Rousseau's social contract, where the general will is not the tyranny of the majority but the collective expression of free individuals acting under moral law. Cascadia thus attempts to reconcile Lockean individualism with Rousseauian civic unity. Sovereignty is both personal and shared, grounded in the right of each to govern oneself, while co-creating a just commonwealth. 2. Civic autonomy and the accountability of power. Cascadia's foundational principle, all power is originally inherent in and consequently derived from the people, revives the republican ideal that governance is stewardship, not dominion. The Constitution directly declares, Greater than all members of government, whether judicial, legislative or executive, are their trustees and servants, and at all times, in a legal way, are accountable to them. Art. I. Section 0. This clause fuses Locke's contractual view of office holding with Montesquieu's doctrine of separation of powers. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu warned that liberty perishes when the same man, or the same body of principles, exercises all three powers. Cascadia, however, goes further. It moralizes accountability. Public office is not merely constrained by law, it is ontologically subordinate to the people's will. Any act, violating the rights of any person, immediately voids the acting perpetrator's lawful authority. Art. I. Section 0. This radical accountability clause transforms the concept of impeachment or recall into an automatic nullification of authority. Power, in this model, is self-dissolving when abused. It introduces a new category of constitutional ethics, self-revocation of illegitimate power, that operationalizes Jefferson's maxim: whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Unlike the American system, which restricts redress to electoral or judicial processes, Cascadia establishes a continuous right of direct moral intervention. The people are not passive litigants but active co-governors, possessing the permanent authority to refuse to cooperate, or even to use sufficient force to repel aggression, if public servants violate the Constitution. Art. I. Section 0. This reimagines the right of resistance as a civic duty rather than an extraordinary measure. 3. The right of lawful resistance and the reimagining of revolution. Cascadia's Section 0.5 codifies perhaps the most philosophically audacious clause in any modern constitutional draft. Greater than the ability to protect these rights with impunity must be afforded defense by law. The natural power in a person to do as they please within the limit to allow others to do the same, shall freely permit without license or need of let by another to afford their own self-security and self-defense, resistance against injustice, rebellion against tyranny, revolution against arbitrary and or illegitimate government. Art. I. Section 0.5. This statement reframes revolution as a constitutional right, not an extralegal act. Drawing upon Locke's doctrine that when rulers act without authority they put themselves into a state of war with the people, Cascadia formalizes this principle within law itself. Revolution, here, becomes not anarchy but lawful renewal, a structured process of moral and civic correction. This philosophy of regulated revolution recalls Jefferson's belief that rebellion is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. Yet Cascadia tempers Jeffersonian insurgency with moral realism. Rebellion is justified only when it reaffirms the natural balance of rights, never when it undermines it. As the Constitution states, the people of Cascadia forge an alliance to strike against arbitrary power, to form and dismiss our government as we see fit, so long as those institutions are compliant with and secure each and every one of our individual natural rights. Preamble. Through this provision, Cascadia attempts what Locke and Jefferson left implicit, a procedural doctrine of renewal. It treats revolution as a feedback mechanism within the constitutional system, analogous to a cybernetic correction process in which public authority is constantly recalibrated to maintain moral equilibrium. In this sense, revolution becomes the ethical immune system of the republic, a lawful expression of collective self-defense. IV. Self-defense as the foundation of civic morality. Cascadia's philosophical originality lies in uniting personal self-defense and political self-defense under the same natural law. The text insists that every person shall possess the right to resist any law or order, if the person reasonably believe the law or order to be in opposition to the will of the people. Art. I. Section 0. This extends the Lockean right to self-preservation into the civic domain. Defending one's liberty from tyrannical command is as natural as defending one's body from assault. This moral unification of bodily and civic self-defense resonates with Kant's moral autonomy, the idea that obedience to unjust law is itself a violation of reason. Cascadia operationalizes this through what might be termed constitutional conscientious objection. Obedience is only moral when law is just. When law contradicts justice, resistance is not disobedience but restoration. The text further guarantees the unrestricted right to own, design, and use all forms of arms and defensive tools, declaring self-defense an unalienable moral condition of personhood. Sec. 19, not excerpted here but part of the constitutional corpus. This extends beyond American Second Amendment jurisprudence, which treats the right as derivative of militia necessity. Cascadia grounds it instead in ontological self-ownership, an embodiment of the principle Locke described: every man has a property in his own person. This universalization of defense implies that moral autonomy cannot exist without practical autonomy. In denying the legitimacy of disarmament, Cascadia denies the moral legitimacy of dependency itself. To deprive individuals of their means of defense is to make them subjects of will rather than agents of conscience. Thus, self-defense becomes not merely a right but a duty of moral preservation, the active maintenance of justice within the self and society. Dash dash dash. V. Rehabilitation, reintegration, and civic restoration. Cascadia's jurisprudence extends the moral continuum of self-defense into the realm of justice and restoration. In contrast to punitive systems that brand convicts as perpetual outsiders, Cascadia's legal philosophy is restorative and regenerative. According to its principles referenced in prior drafts and related constitutional sections, there is no exile, and once a person serves their sentence and is no longer considered a threat of recidivism, they are fully restored to all rights, powers, capacities, immunities, and privileges. This model mirrors the Stoic and Lockean conception of human dignity as inviolable. Punishment, in this view, is not moral retribution but a temporary rebalancing of social equilibrium. Once balance is restored, the full dignity of citizenship must be reinstated. This philosophy transcends the U.S. approach, in which disenfranchisement often persists beyond sentence completion, contradicting the Lockean premise that punishment's moral function ends once justice is satisfied. By erasing the legal distinction between former offender and citizen, Cascadia reasserts the principle of perpetual moral agency. Every person remains a participant in the civic covenant. This extends to probation, parole, and post-sentence restoration. Probation functions as guarded liberty, parole as tested liberty, and restoration as reclaimed liberty. The underlying ethic is that liberty, once forfeited for just cause, must always be recoverable through repentance and reform. This is an institutional expression of what Jefferson called the redeeming principle of republican government, that error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. Cascadia's commitment to reintegration is a form of applied forgiveness, binding the state to the moral law of renewal that it demands from its citizens. VI. Ethical governance and the non-aggression principle. Cascadia grounds its political ethics in a doctrine akin to the libertarian non-aggression principle (NAP), but reinterprets it as a civic commandment rather than a private creed. It mandates that no individual has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another. This is all from which the laws should enforce on them. Section 0. This defines justice as the absence of coercion, echoing both Locke's "no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, or possessions," and Montesquieu's assertion that liberty consists in the power of doing what we ought to will. Yet Cascadia extends non-aggression from interpersonal morality to institutional ethics. Governments themselves are bound by NAP logic. When the government assumes other functions, this becomes unjust usurpation and oppression. Thus, tyranny is not merely an excess of power, it is a moral aggression against the natural boundaries of sovereignty. Through algorithmic governance and open-source transparency provisions Section 0, Cascadia seeks to create an environment in which governmental power is perpetually observable and correctable. These mechanisms embody Montesquieu's vision of a self-regulating system, but with cybernetic feedback loops replacing 18th-century checks and balances. The republic becomes not a static structure but a living system of moral equilibrium, a dynamic balance between liberty and responsibility. 7. Civic renewal and the ethics of peaceful reform. Cascadia transforms the moral vocabulary of revolution into one of continuous civic renewal. Reform is not conceived as rupture, but as respiration, the cyclical breathing of a living republic. The Constitution explicitly recognizes that all power of governance is inherent in the people, and they have at all times a right to alter, reform, or abolish the government in such manner as they may think proper. Preamble. In classical republicanism, reform was episodic, constitutional amendments or revolutions occurring once per epoch. Cascadia introduces a recursive sovereignty, in which reform is structurally encoded as an ever-present function of governance. This reflects a cybernetic or feedback republic, where lawful correction replaces insurgency. The ethical core of this principle aligns with Thoreau's civil disobedience, 1849. If the law requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Cascadia converts Thoreau's moral imperative into constitutional doctrine. Refusal to comply with unjust orders is not rebellion, but obedience to higher law. Thus, the right of reform in Cascadia is twofold: reactive, resisting tyranny, and proactive, preventing tyranny. It makes the citizen both guardian and governor, both conscience and executor of justice. The state's durability depends not on coercive authority but on the perpetual moral vigilance of its people. 8. Comparative reflections, Cascadia and the United States. The U.S. Constitution established liberty through structure, separation of powers, federalism, and a Bill of Rights designed to contain governmental overreach. Cascadia, by contrast, establishes liberty through principle, a moral architecture that precedes and supersedes institutional design. The difference is between a government that cannot act unjustly, and one that must not. Where the U.S. relies on formal procedures of accountability, elections, courts, and checks, Cascadia integrates moral immediacy. Every citizen is endowed with the right, and duty, to enforce justice in real time. In this sense, Cascadia fulfills what Jefferson and Madison only theorized, a republic of perpetual civic activation. Moreover, while the American model oscillates between conservative preservation and progressive reform, Cascadia seeks synthesis, a distributist equilibrium of liberty and equality. It aligns with the distributist ideal of self-sufficient communities and the Jeffersonian agrarian vision of moral independence. Yet it also integrates progressive scientific rationality, demanding that governance be informed by science, reason, and evidence. Section 0. This duality, ethical tradition fused with empirical governance, embodies the Enlightenment ideal of reason as moral practice. Philosophically, Cascadia transcends classical liberalism by embedding natural law into civic technology. Its insistence on open-source governance, citizen referenda, and algorithmic transparency represents the digital evolution of Locke's social contract, a contract now monitored, amended, and executed by the people themselves. IX. The moral philosophy of Project 2028, personal sovereignty and collective defense. Project 2028, Cascadia's visionary framework for digital sovereignty and decentralized governance, embodies the practical application of the Constitution's moral premises. It situates personal sovereignty not as isolation but as the foundation of collective defense. As Ghost Liberty's writings assert, the Cascadia of sovereign persons envisions a federation of autonomous beings voluntarily coalescing into mutual defense and mutual respect. This moral model unites Locke's individualism with the communal ethics of modern distributism. The right to self-ownership becomes the moral nucleus around which all collective systems orbit. The League of Sovereign DAOs and the DAO of DAOs D∞D illustrate the transposition of moral autonomy into digital architecture. Each person and community acts as a node in a recursive network of conscience. This cyber-libertarian structure recalls Montesquieu's conception of federated republics, small, virtuous units sustaining one another through balance and exchange, but it replaces geographic proximity with informational symmetry. In doing so, Cascadia realizes Jefferson's dream of ward republics, extended through digital voluntarism, self-rule as network virtue. Project 2028's moral thesis is thus profoundly Lockean. Liberty is both the condition and the product of lawful association.